I only needed shelter. But someone had been waiting for me beneath that workbench.
She was 21 and homeless. No home, no family, no inheritance, just a canvas bag and $6 she had counted twice before leaving. And with that amount, she bought a forgotten hourglass maker's studio on Nantucket Island, Nantucket County, Massachusetts, a place marked lost in 1978. The roof had collapsed inward. The windows were mostly broken. Nantucket County condemned it in October 1999, with demolition planned for the following spring season. Beneath its old workbench sat a hidden compartment unopened for decades, holding something buried in the sandhopper that would change Stella's life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Stella Whitaker had been searching for a place to belong her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in a narrow white house near the Massachusetts coast where the mornings smelled of salt, pine smoke and coffee left warming too long beside her father's tools. Her childhood was measured by small repairs, not grand moments. A loose hinge, a torn sail, a cracked bowl passed from one careful hand to another. Her father, Thomas Whitaker, repaired old wooden boats after commercial fishing slowed, and he taught Stella that anything made by human hands carried the marks of the person who cared for it. When he died, the house became quieter, but his workbench remained untouched. The chisels stayed aligned. The jars of nails stayed labelled. The person who understood that quiet language best was an old sailor named Clara Voss, a man Stella met when she was 12 at the harbour. Elias had lost his sight after decades at sea, but his hands still remembered every knot, every grain of wood, every instrument he had once held beneath open skies. Every Saturday morning Stella walked to his small cottage with bread from her father, and spent the afternoon learning the forgotten craft of making marine sandglasses. Elias had a brass compass scarred from years of use, a wool cap with a missing button, and a habit of running his fingertips over every tool before touching it. He taught her to prepare the sand slowly, drying it near gentle heat, filtering it through fine screens and sealing the glass neck with wax and patience. Time is the only cargo no sailor can recover once lost, Elias told her while they worked beside the window. Keep it carefully, and it will tell you where you have been. Those words stayed with Stella because Elias never spoke about time as something frightening. To him, it was something that could be shaped by attention, like glass warmed enough to bend without breaking. When Elias died, the harbour seemed to lose one of its old sounds. His cottage was emptied by distant relatives who did not understand the value of worn tools and unfinished pieces. The hand-blown glass bulbs, cedar moulds, and notebooks filled with measurements disappeared into boxes that Stella never saw again. Years later, after her father's funeral, another loss arrived quietly. Her uncle Richard Whitaker appeared with folders, signatures, and a calm voice that never rose above a whisper. He claimed he had handled the legal matters, and that the old family house now belonged to him through paperwork. Stella did not understand. Richard was not cruel in obvious ways. He wore clean coats, spoke politely to neighbours, and smiled while explaining that some things were simply complicated. But he kept the house locked, kept the documents closed, and treated Stella's questions as childish interruptions. On the morning everything ended. Rain tapped against the porch while Stella stood outside the house she had known since childhood. A cardboard box of clothes sat beside her. Her father's old canvas tool bag rested on top. The leather handle split from years of use. Richard placed the final shirt into the box without looking at her. "Stella, take your things and leave now, please." Her mother stood inside the doorway with one hand around a coffee cup. She watched the locks change. She watched the box move across the porch. She did not argue, did not step forward, and did not say Stella's name. The silence from that doorway was heavier than the rain. For 6 weeks, Stella carried everything she owned. She slept first in a bus station corner in Worcester, then on a church basement cot in Providence, Rhode Island, and later beneath a covered picnic shelter outside New Bedford when the nights became too cold for the streets. Her money fell from $6 to $3, then to coins gathered from the bottoms of borrowed bags and jacket pockets. She washed in public restrooms, ate soup offered by strangers, and spent afternoons inside libraries because they were warm, and nobody asked why she stayed. In Boston, she found an hour of quiet at a wooden table near a window overlooking the winter streets. That was where she saw the classified advertisement. It was printed in an old local paper stored in the library archives. The words were plain. An abandoned Hourglass maker's studio on Nantucket was available through county disposal. The property had no working utilities, no active owner, and no value according to the listing. The price was $6 because that was the amount required to transfer the neglected parcel before demolition. Stella read the notice until the paper softened beneath her fingers. The address belonged to a craft she thought had vanished with Elias. The place was not promising safety. It was not offering comfort. It was only a door that had remained unopened. 2 days later, she boarded a ferry with her canvas bag, her father's worn tools, and exactly $6 in her pocket, carrying herself toward an abandoned studio where someone had left behind more than dust. The ferry left the mainland before sunrise, when the water was a flat sheet of grey and the wind pressed cold against Stella's coat. She stood near the rear railing with her canvas bag at her feet, watching the shoreline disappear behind a thin veil of mist. The crossing lasted longer than she expected. She counted the minutes by the rhythm of the engine and the gulls following the boat. When the ferry reached Nantucket Harbour, she had less than $3 remaining and a folded deed agreement tucked safely inside her father's old tool bag. From the harbour, Stella walked. The property was not close to the village. The county map showed a route that looked simple, but the road stretched farther beneath her boots than the ink suggested. She walked nearly 7 miles along narrow lanes bordered by old stone walls and wind-bent grass. The first night, unable to find shelter before darkness settled, she slept inside an abandoned hay barn outside town, where the temperature dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. She covered herself with a canvas tarp and listened to mice moving through the straw above her. By morning, her fingers were stiff, but she continued. When she finally reached the village, Nantucket was moving at its own careful pace. She passed the harbour bakery where bread cooled on wooden racks, the old general store with painted lettering faded by salt air, the cobbler's shop where boots hung from a ceiling beam, the small cafe near Main Street with handwritten menus in the window, and the hardware store where tools rested behind glass counters instead of bright displays. She did not stop at any of them. The county clerk's office stood in a brick building with narrow windows and a brass plaque beside the entrance. Stella pushed open the heavy door and stepped into a room that smelled of paper, dust, and furniture polish. Behind the counter sat a woman with silver hair braided tightly down her back. She wore round glasses connected by a thin chain and kept a small wooden ruler beside the stack of forms in front of her. Her nameplate read, Margaret Hale, County Clerk. Margaret looked over the paperwork, then looked at Stella. You understand this property has no electricity? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not repair it if the structure fails? Yes, ma'am. You understand the previous inspection recommended closure and removal? Yes, ma'am. You understand this transfer carries no guarantee that anything inside has value? Yes, ma'am. Margaret studied her for a moment, then placed the papers beneath the old brass stamp sitting beside her hand. You are certain? Stella nodded. The stamp came down with a heavy sound that seemed too loud for the quiet room. The clerk slid the document across the counter. The property is at the end of Wawinet Road, past the old cedar fence. Follow the lane until you see 2 walnut trees growing close together. The studio sits behind them. Stella signed her name carefully. Margaret watched the final line of ink appear. Then her expression changed slightly. Whitaker. Stella looked up. Your last name? Yes, ma'am. The clerk removed her glasses and folded them in her hand. I knew an Elias Voss. The name stopped Stella before she could answer. Margaret touched the corner of the deed. He spoke about a girl who listened when everyone else was rushing. A girl who learned how to hold glass without forcing it. The room became still. He said if she ever found that place, she would know what to do with it. Stella lowered her eyes to the paper. For years, Elias had existed only in memories and missing objects. Hearing his name in a county office, spoken by someone who had known him, made the distance between past and present feel smaller. Margaret returned the stamped document. Take care of what is still there. Stella thanked her and stepped outside. The walk to the studio followed the road Margaret described. Wawinet Road curved between low fields and old fences. Near the bend, she met a woman carrying a basket of apples beside a large brown dog with a white mark over one eye. Looking for the old glass house, the woman asked. Stella nodded. The dog sniffed her boots and sat down. Nobody has lived there in years, the woman said. But the walnut trees still grow. She pointed ahead. The trees stood together near the end of the lane, their branches reaching over the path like they had been waiting for someone to return. Beyond them was the studio. The building was smaller than Stella imagined. It measured roughly 24 feet by 30 feet, built with weathered cedar siding and hand-cut fieldstone around the foundation. The roof sagged along the eastern side, covered with grey shingles darkened by decades of storms. A brick chimney leaned slightly above the rear wall. A wooden sign hung above the door. Voss Marine Sandglasses. Half the letters had faded away. Stella placed her hand against the door before opening it. The wood felt cold beneath her palm. Inside, the front room held the silence of a place that had not expected visitors. Dust covered the floorboards. Thin glass fragments reflected the afternoon light. The air smelled of old cedar, dry sand, and the faint sweetness of wax left behind in forgotten containers. She moved slowly from room to room. The front workspace contained a long oak table with deep cuts along the surface where tools had been used repeatedly. The back room held shelves lined with empty wooden frames and cracked glass bulbs. A small kitchen area remained untouched, with a rusted kettle beside a shelf where a single ceramic cup still rested. She ran her fingers across the walls and felt the uneven plaster beneath the paint. She opened the windows carefully, but only one moved enough to let in air. The smell changed immediately. Cold ocean air entered the room. That night, Stella slept on the floor beside the old workbench, using her coat as a pillow. The boards beneath her shifted with every movement. Somewhere inside the walls, something small scratched and moved. Outside, the wind travelled through the grass and pressed against the damaged roof. She looked toward the ceiling where moonlight entered through a broken section of wood. The studio was not comfortable. It was not safe, but for the first time in 6 weeks, she was sleeping somewhere that had a door she could close. Time keeps what people leave behind, and it returns those things only to the hands willing to wait. The first 3 days at the studio were measured by small repairs and careful listening. Stella carried water from the old well behind the building and discovered the pump still worked if she pulled the handle slowly. She cleaned the outhouse with a bucket, a brush, and boiled water from the kettle she found in the kitchen. At night, instead of fighting the sounds around her, she learnt them. One floorboard near the doorway creaked twice. The plank beside the workbench groaned once when the temperature dropped. The boards were beginning to tell her where they were weak. On the 4th morning, she walked into town to buy supplies and entered the hardware store she had passed when she arrived. A man stood behind the counter with a missing front tooth and a left hand wrapped in a faded wool glove, even indoors. His name was Samuel Pike. He had owned the store for 40 years and kept every receipt written by hand in a leather notebook. The store smelled of cedar shavings, metal, and old coffee. Wooden drawers filled the walls, each labelled in careful black letters. Samuel looked at the list Stella carried. Voss Studio. She nodded. He looked toward the window for a moment. My grandfather bought nails from Elias. Never forgot that man's measurements. Stella placed the few coins she had left on the counter. I need enough to make it through the first repairs. Samuel counted the money, then pushed it back toward her. Open a credit account. I cannot pay yet. I did not ask if you could. He pulled a small ledger from beneath the counter and wrote her name at the top of a blank page. Samuel also handed her a thin manual with a torn cover. Old repair guide. My father used it. Take it. Inside were handwritten notes about roofs, chimneys, and preserving historic wood. Stella carried the book back to the studio as carefully as if it were another heirloom. The first purchases were simple. A chimney brush cost $18, a bucket of lime mortar was $24, a pair of work gloves was $9, a box of galvanized nails was $7, a replacement saw blade was $6. The prices were written in Samuel's ledger, not because he expected payment immediately, but because he believed keeping records was part of keeping promises. The chimney became her first serious obstacle. For years, rain had entered through the cracked crown, soaking the upper bricks and breaking them apart during winter freezes. When Stella opened the damaged section, powdered mortar fell like grey flour into her hands. Creosote had built up inside the flue in thick black layers. She spent 3 afternoons cleaning it. First, she lowered a stiff wire brush from the roof, opening through the chimney throat. Then she scraped away the hardened creosote deposits with a metal tool, collecting the debris in a bucket below. She measured the new mortar carefully, mixing hydraulic lime with fire clay in a ratio Samuel recommended, keeping the mixture firm enough to hold but soft enough to move with the old bricks. The work was slow. Each brick had to be lifted, cleaned, and reset. She spent nearly 9 hours one day repairing only a small section above the fireplace. By evening, her shoulders ached and her fingers smelled of ash and stone dust. When the chimney finally stood straight again, Stella carried in dry wood from the shed. The first fire was small. She watched the smoke rise into the chimney instead of spilling back into the room. The draft pulled cleanly upward. She sat beside the flames and heated a simple meal of potatoes and beans in a small iron pot. The room was still damaged, but it was warm. The next week, she began examining the workroom. She did not search for anything valuable. She searched for signs of how Elias had worked. On the shelves, she found a wooden ruler with burn marks near the edge, 3 cedar molds shaped for glass necks, a brass funnel stained dark from years of use, a spool of old hemp cord, a chipped porcelain bowl that still smelled faintly of beeswax, and a small notebook filled with measurements written in a handwriting she recognized. Near the back wall sat the oak workbench. It was the largest piece in the room, built from thick boards joined without modern screws. Stella cleaned the surface slowly, removing layers of dust and sand until the grain appeared again. That was when she noticed something unusual. The brass funnel attached to the center of the table sounded different. She tapped the side. Most of the metal gave a sharp ringing sound. This one answered with a dull note. She lifted it. It was heavier than it should have been. Stella turned it over and examined the base. A thin line appeared beneath the cedar-coloured wooden covering. She ran her fingernail along the edge and felt a small movement. The bottom was not one piece. It was 2. She did not force it open. Instead, she cleaned the surrounding area, found a small screwdriver among the remaining tools, and removed the tiny screws one at a time. Beneath the outer layer was a round cedar disc fitted perfectly into the hollow space. The craftsmanship was exact. Someone had built the compartment intentionally. Inside were 3 wrapped packages and a narrow tin box. Stella carried everything to the table and waited until morning before opening them. The first package contained tools, not ordinary tools, but the ones Elias had once described. A miniature glass cutter with a bone handle, a set of brass measuring spoons, a wooden gauge marked with tiny lines for timing sand flow. Each piece had been wrapped in cloth and protected from moisture. The second package held raw materials, small glass bulbs, bags of dried mineral sand, and a block of beeswax hardened with age. The third package contained several sheets of notes tied with string. The tin box was heavier. Inside were old coins, folded papers, and a military medal wrapped in cotton. Stella counted everything twice. The total came to $33,700. The money was made of different pieces of history. There were Morgan silver dollars dated from 1885 and 1891, Indian head pennies from the late 1800s, buffalo nickels from the early 20th century, and mercury dimes from the 1930s. The medal belonged to someone named Thomas Voss. The engraving showed the year 1944. She held it in her palm but did not open the papers. Not yet. The discovery felt too large to rush through. Elias had always taught her that some things were ruined by impatience. That evening, Stella walked beyond the walnut trees to the edge of the water. The tide moved quietly beneath the fading light. She sat on the cold ground with the unopened letter beside her and watched the waves arrive and disappear. She had spent years believing everything important had been taken away, but the ocean kept returning what it carried. Time keeps what people leave behind, and it returns those things only to the hands willing to wait. The next morning, Stella carried the tin box back to the oak table before sunrise. The room was colder than the night before, and the glass fragments beneath her boots made a faint sound as she crossed the floor. She lifted the first sheet of paper from the package. The handwriting stopped her. The letters leaned slightly to the right, with the same careful pressure she remembered from Elias's notes. It was not his hand, but it carried the same patience. Someone had written each word slowly, as though every sentence mattered. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. Stella unfolded it. My dear one, whoever you are, if these words have reached you, then the house has found another careful pair of hands. My name is Clara Voss. I write this from St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, after Dr. Helen Carver confirmed that I have pulmonary fibrosis. The doctors have been kind, but they have told me my lungs will not recover. I have had enough time to understand what must be kept and what must be released. Our family began with my great-grandfather Samuel Voss, born in 1821 in Salem, Massachusetts, who learned glasswork from coastal craftsmen before opening this Nantucket studio in 1848. His son Elias Voss Sr., born in 1854, continued the trade and taught his daughter Margaret, born in 1887, who preserved the marine sandglass patterns through the changing years. Margaret's son Thomas Voss, born in 1919, served in the United States Navy during the Second World War and never returned from the Pacific. His absence changed our family, but it did not end our work. My husband, Robert, and I kept the tools because we believed someone would one day understand them. The final trade of this studio closed on March 14th, 1968. For more than 30 years, the door has remained shut. I hid these things because I could not find someone who valued the work more than the money. The tools are not valuable because they are old. They are valuable because hands once depended on them. When you prepare sand, dry it at 220 degrees Fahrenheit until the moisture leaves completely. Mix mineral sand with 1 part fine marble powder for every 4 parts sand. When sealing the glass neck, warm beeswax gently and allow the joint to rest for 12 hours before testing. A proper half-hour glass must be measured again and again, never trusted after a single trial. Do not hurry the craft. Do not hurry yourself. An inheritance is not a possession placed in your hands. It is a responsibility placed before you. The work you continue matters more than the name attached to it. If you're reading this, then someone before you believed you would arrive. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Clara Elizabeth Voss, November 3, 1999. Stella read the letter once. Then she read it again. The second time, she noticed the places where the paper had been folded. The creases were original. Someone had carried those words for years before trusting them to another person. She folded the pages along those same lines and returned them to the tin box. For a long time, she remained at the table without moving. Then she stepped through the back door. Behind the studio, beneath the walnut trees, she found the marker Clara had described. It was a small flat stone near the edge of the garden, covered by moss and winter leaves. The carved name was simple, Voss. Stella brushed away the dirt with her fingers. No monument stood there. No polished stone. Only a quiet place where someone had chosen to remain connected to the land. She returned inside before sunset and opened one of the old wooden drawers. At the back was a small brass oil lamp. She cleaned the glass, filled it carefully, and lit the wick. The flame moved gently against the dark room. Over the following days, the studio began to receive small pieces of kindness from people who had noticed Stella's work. Samuel Pike from the hardware store left a bundle of reclaimed boards beside the door and pretended it was simply extra material. The woman with the brown dog brought apples from her orchard and refused payment. Margaret Hale, the county clerk, mailed a copy of an old property map with a note saying only, "For the records." Doris from the cafe, who had watched Stella pass by each morning, began setting aside a paper bag with bread near the counter. Kindness rarely arrived with ceremony. Sometimes it arrived quietly, waiting beside a door. Before we continue, tell us about one small kindness you still remember. Maybe it was a stranger's gesture, a neighbor's help, or a moment when someone made a difficult day easier. Where did it happen? And why has it stayed with you? That night, Stella slept beside the old workbench with the letter, the tools, and the lamp close by. The studio creaked around her. For once, the sounds did not feel unfamiliar. They felt like an answer. The first snow arrived on December 6th, 1999. By morning, 6 inches covered the yard and the damaged eastern roof slope had collected a heavy white layer that pulled against the weakened boards. Stella carried Samuel Pike's repair manual to the table and read the roofing chapter 3 times before climbing the ladder. The measurements were simple but exact. The roof section required 18 bundles of cedar shingles, 6 rolls of felt underlayment, and nearly 3 pounds of galvanized nails for the repaired surface of roughly 720 square feet. Samuel noticed her calculation when she returned to the store. "You counted twice." I needed to be certain. He reached beneath the counter and placed an old leather roofing hatchet in her hands. "My uncle used this. He would want it working again." The local man who helped her was Walter Briggs, a retired roofer with a bent thumb and a habit of tapping wood before trusting it. He refused payment before she even offered. "Keep your money. Keep the house." For 11 days, they worked in the cold. Stella learned to replace the damaged sister rafter beside the original beam, snap chalk lines without wasting material, and drive each nail with 3 controlled strokes rather than force. Walter showed her how the old craftsman listened to the sound of a nail entering wood. "That nail's proud. Pull it." The 2 sentences were enough. By mid-December, the roof no longer allowed snow to enter. The studio looked almost unchanged from the road, but inside, the ceiling stayed dry for the first time in decades. The chimney required more patience. When Stella inspected it again in January, She found spalling bricks along the upper courses and mortar reduced to loose powder between the joints. Every repair had to respect the original structure. She removed the damaged sections by hand, cleaning each brick before placing it aside. The replacement mixture used 3 parts hydraulic lime mortar to 1 part fire clay, creating a compound that could tolerate the repeated heating and cooling of the fireplace. For 3 weeks, she worked in temperatures that rarely climbed above the 20s Fahrenheit. Every 15 minutes, she returned her hands to her coat pockets because her fingers became too numb to grip the tools. The cold slowed everything, but the work became more accurate because every movement required attention. The final test fire came late in January. Stella lit a small flame and watched the smoke rise. It did not curl back into the room. It travelled upward. The chimney was drawing cleanly. The floors revealed their condition only after the roof and chimney were secure. Beneath years of dust, Stella found wide white pine planks, held together with hand-cut rosehead nails. The boards were dark from age, but the grain remained strong. She rented a random orbit sander from Samuel for $14 per day. The work moved in 3 passes. The first used 80 grit paper to remove the damaged surface. The second used 120 grit to smooth the remaining marks. The final pass used 220 grit until the boards felt almost soft beneath her fingertips. After cleaning away the dust, she applied 3 coats of oil finish, allowing each layer to settle before adding the next. The final cure required 48 hours without heavy walking. The wood changed slowly. What had looked almost black beneath the years of neglect became a deep honey colour that moved toward mahogany in the afternoon light. One morning, Stella woke early and planned to work through the day. Then she saw the great blue heron standing alone near the marsh. It remained still for nearly an hour. So did she. She carried no tools outside that day. The windows came last because they demanded careful hands. There were 8 in total. 3 had no glass remaining. 4 held cracked panes that shook in their frames. 1 original pane from 1788 remained intact, slightly uneven and full of tiny imperfections created during its making. Stella preserved that one. For the others, she repaired the wooden frames and used DAP 33 glazing putty, pressing it into place with the same slow pressure she had once learned from Elias. The new glass needed room to move with temperature changes, not a seal so tight that it would break. She replaced the old sash cord with 1/4-inch cotton rope and tied the counterweight using a careful figure-8 knot. The final window was the smallest one facing the walnut trees. When Stella secured the last piece of glass and stepped back, a chickadee landed on a branch outside. It stayed there for several seconds. Then it flew away. The room remained quiet, but it was beginning to hold light again. The walls waited longer than the windows. In late February, Stella began repairing the damaged plaster around the fireplace, where years of heat and moisture had separated the surface from the old hand-split oak lath beneath. The original builders had used horsehair plaster, and Samuel Pike found an old bag of preserved horsehair in the back room of his hardware store. He placed it beside her tools without explanation. 3 patches failed before she understood the mixture. The first cracked because it dried too quickly. The second separated because the surface beneath was not prepared. The third held for a week before falling away in one clean piece. After that, Stella slowed down. She mixed lime plaster with the horsehair carefully, pressing the material into the uneven spaces between the lath. The scratch coat was scored with crossing marks so the next layer could grip. The brown coat was applied at 3/8 of an inch and allowed a full 72 hours to cure. The final finish coat measured roughly 1/8 of an inch and required a steady hand. When she finally brushed away the remaining dust, the wall looked as though it had always belonged there. She placed her palm against the surface. These patches will hold another 100 years. By March, the repairs had become something the village quietly noticed. Doris, the cafe owner, was the first to make her kindness impossible to refuse. She had a silver streak through her dark hair and always wore a blue apron with flower on the pocket. Each morning, she left paper bags on Stella's doorstep. Bread, soup, sometimes a small pastry. When Stella tried to pay her, Doris shook her head. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Then she walked away before Stella could answer. A week later, Caleb arrived on a faded Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, tall and quiet, with paint stains on his jacket sleeves from working after school. "I can cut the wood pile," he said. Stella offered money. He refused. "My mother said about your grandfather." That was all he explained. He spent the afternoon splitting fallen walnut branches into manageable pieces and left before sunset. Reverend Boyd passed the studio almost every morning. He was a thin man with a worn brown coat and a silver watch chain visible beneath his collar. He never entered without being invited. He simply stopped near the gate, tipped his hat, and offered the same 4 words: "May the work continue." Then he walked on. The cellar remained untouched until February 11th. Stella had avoided it because the entrance stones were unstable, and some repairs required more than patience. When she finally cleared the area, she found a 12 by 15-foot room beneath the studio with a fieldstone floor and 7 granite steps descending into the earth. At the center rested a dressed granite slab. A small craft mark was carved into its surface. Stella cleaned the stone but did not lift it. Some things deserved to remain closed. While inspecting the 3rd step, she noticed a narrow gap between the granite and the wall. Wedged inside was a small oak box darkened by age. The box contained a brass key. The bow of the key was shaped like the symbol used by marine sandglass makers. 2 curved lines surrounding a falling grain of sand. There was also a tintype photograph. The image showed a young woman standing outside the cottage in 1903. She held a familiar tool in one hand and looked directly toward the camera. Stella stared at the face. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough to make her lower the photograph. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Clara Voss, daughter of Samuel Voss, age 25, summer of 1903. The brass key remained on the mantel. Stella did not know what it opened. She did not force the answer. Spring arrived slowly. The snow withdrew from the fields. The creek behind the studio grew louder each week, and green walnut catkins appeared along the branches that had stood bare through winter. Stella considered beginning the full sandglass craft immediately. Instead, she decided against it. She would spend only 1 coin from the hidden money on materials. She would practice with small samples first, learn the behavior of the glass, the sand, and the seals before attempting anything meant to last. The studio had taught her enough to know that patience was not delay. It was preparation. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Stella completed her first true marine sandglass. She did not announce it. She did not place it in a shop window. She simply carried the finished piece to the oak table where Elias had once taught her. The glass bulbs were clear and balanced. The sand flowed evenly for 30 minutes. And the cedar frame fit around the instrument with the same careful measurements written in the old notebooks. She held it near the window and watched the final grains fall. The cottage had changed without losing itself. The roof held firm, the chimney drew cleanly, the floors carried the warm colour of old wood instead of years of neglect. The original 1788 window remained in place. catching afternoon light in its uneven surface. The workroom held the restored tools, the brass funnel, and the lamp Stella had lit on the first night after reading Clara's letter. The brass key remained the one unanswered question, until the following spring. Stella walked beneath the walnut trees, carrying the key and examining the old branches. Near the trunk of the oldest tree, she found a small brass plate hidden beneath layers of bark and weather. The key fit. Inside the hollow space behind the plate was a folded cloth bundle. Within it rested a carefully preserved 48-star American flag and another letter. The paper was dated July 4th, 1918, during the First World War. The writer was Margaret Voss, who had hidden the flag after her brother Thomas left for service overseas. The note described the fear of waiting, the hope of return, and the promise that the craft would continue even if the family changed. The military medal from the tin box belonged to Thomas. Stella carried it to the family section at Nantucket's old cemetery on Memorial Day, May 30, 2026, the anniversary she chose because it connected the work of the living with the sacrifices of those who never came home. She placed flowers beside the marker. Then she returned to the studio. The money from the hidden compartment remained mostly untouched. She used only a few coins. One paid for glass samples. One paid for mineral sand. One paid for replacement materials when a batch failed. The remaining funds were sealed inside a new envelope marked. For the next one, the shop reopened quietly. There was no celebration. Doris placed a simple index card on the cafe corkboard. Marine Sandglass Workshop. Limited hours. More than 40 names eventually appeared on the mailing list. People who wanted to learn the old process or simply receive a note when a new piece was finished. Caleb returned one afternoon carrying a hand-carved wooden sign. He had spent months shaping it from walnut. The letters were simple. Voss Marine Sandglass's Daughters. Stella ran her fingers over the final word. She understood why he had added it. The craft had never belonged only to one person. That winter, Stella began writing her own letter. She used the same opening words Clara had written decades earlier. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote about the repairs, the failures, the people who arrived with tools and food, and the quiet responsibility of receiving something that had survived longer than anyone expected. She placed the letter inside the cedar compartment beneath the workbench. Time keeps what people leave behind, and it returns those things only to the hands willing to wait. The studio continued holding the sounds of careful work, the turning of tools, the movement of sand, the footsteps of someone entering a place that had once been forgotten. The Hourglass maker's studio waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, inside Margaret Hale's old wooden desk drawer, the $6 bill remained folded beneath the original transfer records. It was never valuable because of what it bought. It was valuable because it marked the moment someone with almost nothing chose to begin again.